So the focus of Section 6 is offshore energy emerging issues. And I'm very pleased for our next presentation to have two presenters, Chris Stewart and Catherine LeBlanc. And the title of their presentation in their paper, very interesting paper, is Going with the Flow, Tidal Regulation in Atlantic Canada. Please join me in welcoming Chris and Catherine.
I guess it's still good morning. Good morning, everyone. I won't take credit for the pithy title of our presentation or the paper. That was all Catherine's doing. We were pleased to sort of find a cross between the things that we do. I'm basically an energy regulatory lawyer, not an environmental lawyer, but the potential development of offshore energy or electricity generation has caused these two legal worlds to meet a little bit, and in the particular context of the potential for the development of using the tides to generate electricity has made it, I think, a topical topic for us to review at this symposium today. Just a little personal note, I grew up in southwestern New Brunswick on the shores of the Bay of Fundy, as I understand some of our sponsors did as well. So I grew up very much with living with the tide and what I used to describe as my father's crony friends, all of whom were lobster and handline fishermen, and learning to sail as a child around those areas. You learned that you sailed part of the time and then you just went wherever the tide took you the rest of the time. And hopefully our presentation, the tide will take us in a good way as well. Even in that area where I grew up at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, we had 24-foot tides. So what that means to those of you who aren't used to thinking in that way is that at absolute dead low tide, when you stand at the edge of the water, and if you stay there till the high tide, there'd be 24 feet of water over your head. It is a tremendous volume of water with tremendous, tremendous energy and power. And all of us are trying to find a way, and certainly our clients are trying to find a way to harness it as part of us growing a renewable energy portfolio. Even today in my office in Moncton, I look out my window and I see the tidal bore on the Petitcodiac River, where when the high tide comes in, basically, actually what I now see on it are surfers. The force of the tide is enough that it creates a surfable wave that rolls up the river twice every 24 hours. So enough of talking about Chris, and Lord knows I could spend some time doing that. But really the four squares of this topic are the development of four somewhat diverse but related circumstances. First is, as we're all familiar with, the increased demand for renewable energy coupled with some technological development. In the other corner, we have the presence of, as I've just been describing, at least anecdotally, powerful and, most importantly, predictable tides, particularly in this area of the country in the Bay of Fundy. As I said, I deal with merchant generators and utilities a lot, and the utility gripe about renewable energy in many situations is its variability. The wind blows, the wind doesn't blow. Or the wind blows everywhere at once, or not everywhere at once. And sometimes we have so much wind in New Brunswick, for example, that we have to spill the water over the dam and shut down the hydro. And then sometimes we don't have any wind, and we have to fire up other generation to try to make the balance with the peaks. So as a renewable energy source, and equally with solar, sometimes it's a sunny day, sometimes it's a cloudy day. But the tides, once the tide and time and tide wait for no man, the tides are equally and always predictable. And from a renewable energy perspective, that predictability and that unceasing source of energy has a real attraction. The other corners of the square are, of course, the diverse and important marine environment that all of this might take place in. And of course, the protection of that diverse and important marine environment. And the potential, not only preservation of that environment for its own sake and all of our sakes, but also the protection of the marine environment for other commercial uses of that marine environment, including, of course, the fisheries. I guess the last corner of this square is, the presence of multiple stakeholders. You have developers, regulators, utilities, fishers, those involved in other uses of the waters, navigation, petroleum development that we've heard a lot about from the folks who were up before us. And so within all of those, I've been describing as a square, but within that circle, within that group, trying to find a way to have the potential and effective development of this renewable resource is a challenge for everyone. So for those of you which may not be familiar, and Catherine by training is an engineer, and I'm by training only a lawyer. I have an arts degree from my undergrad. With respect to all of those of you in the room who hold arts degrees, really tidal power generation occurs in two basic ways. First, you have what we call a tidal range, and for the lack of a better way to put it, it's equivalent to hydro storage. So you dam off a place, you open a gate, the tide comes in, you fill it full of water, and you drain the water off running a turbine. And there is an example here in Nova Scotia and at the Annapolis Tidal Station. Or you create a barrage across a shore, like they have at Annapolis, and as the tide runs through and runs out, you run turbines on the way by. Much in the river, you'd have sort of equivalent to run-of-the-river hydro generation. Or we have the potential for what are in-stream turbines. So, and I'll show you a picture in a little later on in the presentation, but there are a whole variety, I guess there's one up there now, that's the Cape Sphere one, a variety of proposals and engineering approaches to catching the current on the way by, either by having some sort of turbine unit resting or attached to the bottom, or one which would float at some point in the stream, turning as the water flows through. The question was posed to me just on the break, and I had a comment here as part of my presentation, and that is, where do we see tidal generation? And of course, if I knew that, I'd probably know the lotto numbers for Saturday, and I'd quit practicing law very quickly. But I have to say, my own personal speculation is, when we were working on this paper and working with some clients, I really do harken back to where we were in the sort of early to mid 90s with respect to wind power generation. At that time, there were still significant technical hurdles to be overcome, not only just in terms of finding efficient turbines that were reliable and would last for 20 years or last within a reasonable operational cycle for 20 years, but also how you run this infrastructure on a commercial scale, how you hook it into the grid, how it works with a generation portfolio. And there were a bunch of challenges to be overcome. We're also in the circumstance where, in those days, the development of a lot of these technologies were being led from the US and from Europe. A lot of false starts, a lot of different designs, a lot of analysis, a lot of ways to make it work. But here we are in 2016, and in the car from the drive from Moncton to Halifax yesterday, we passed on the highway no less than 3 active, fully operational wind farms of various sizes. So they're commonplace now, and part of the generation portfolio of even smaller jurisdictions like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, certainly in Quebec, and certainly out west in Alberta, as I understand it. So where do I think we are? I think we are, on the edge in that same early phase that, sadly, I'm old enough to recall from the early 90s. So being lawyers, we talk about what the law is, and that's what we do. And so Catherine is going to take a few moments and run through the regulatory regimes in 3 or the 4 of the Atlantic Canadian provinces to the extent they exist, and some they barely do. And then I'm going to come back after a little bit and have a few more comments about some other issues in relation to tidal generation.
And so first I'll start off with the jurisdiction questions. As Professor Lalonde spoke this morning extensively on that, I won't get into the marine border issues, but talking about tidal paper themes, navigating foggy waters was one done in Dal here. And that paper also goes extensively into that subject as well. And then on the jurisdiction over the activities, so even if within an area that could be considered provincial waters or federal waters, there's different agencies or different jurisdiction levels of government that would have powers or interests over the activities happening in the water. For example, the province would be responsible for the development and management of the energy facilities, whereas the federal government would be in charge of anything, for example, the interprovincial aspects of it, or fisheries and navigation issues. And here for federal regulation, as we spoke about earlier, the CEAA would require an environmental assessment for an in-stream tidal project that would be over 50 megawatts. Or a project would have that would have adverse effects or public concerns, so they also have another way of requiring an environmental assessment. This can be undertaken by a responsible authority or be it cooperation between different agencies to undergo the environmental assessment. In the assessment, they would look at the effects in case there's malfunctions or accidents, and mitigation measures like earlier presentations, alternate means of going for the same purpose, and public comments on the project. There'd be other permits required aside from doing the environmental assessment, such as fisheries permits, not interference with navigation, ocean disposal. And as well, another consideration is the protected areas. And again, there's multiple agencies that have different regimes for protecting areas in the water, such as under DFO, Parks Canada, and the environment. And now for provincial regulation, as Chris had said, between the different provinces, there's one extent to the other of how they have regulated tidal energy. Prince Edward Island, they decided in an energy review a couple years ago that the costs were too high to even attempt to get involved in tidal energy. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, they had the same opinion, but they were also interested in exporting their knowledge for hostile marine environments. So they said even if we're not going to get into tidal development specifically, we can help out these other provinces with any experience and knowledge we have in those environments. Now in New Brunswick, I'll go into it a little deeper. They have set a goal of 40% renewable energy by 2020 and have different programs, renewable programs, such as small-scale programs owned by Aboriginal businesses or local entities, as well as an industrial program. In New Brunswick, an environmental assessment would be required for projects over 3 megawatts, or projects that affect unique, rare, or endangered features of the environment. And in that regime, the minister would make guidelines as to what is required for the environmental assessment. As well, the province developed a tidal policy. There was one that was in place in the late 2000s, and then there's the current one that was in place in 2011 and hasn't been updated since. And in that policy, they divided the regulation by stage of the project. So there'd be the research phase, the experimental phase, and then the deployment phase. And As well, they separated the regulations for a regular project versus a project that would be in high resource activity area. So we're speaking before about whales, and there's a protected area for whales, and the area around there would have more of a distance between the protected area and where the development could occur. And for the resource high activity area, the project would not be able to go over 7.5 megawatts. There's also other policies in New Brunswick related to coastal areas and submerged land. And contrary to New Brunswick, who had created a policy and nothing really has happened in the last 5 years, in Nova Scotia, they've kind of ramped up their efforts in the last couple of years. So again, same thing, 40% by 2020. For that province, there's an environmental assessment required for over 2 megawatts. And they would look at information such as is the baseline information sufficient and any adverse effects by the project. They also have projects on the electricity side, which is for a feed-in tariff, and there's also a project that was a community feed-in tariff, but that one was closed in 2015 because of the high costs of the program. In 2012, they developed a renewable energy strategy, and that went on 3 different aspects, on research, development, and regulation. So they separated what would be the plan for each of those different phases. And then in 2014, they developed a statement of best practices that concentrated on different principles, including sustainability, looking at the cumulative effects of the project, consultation with other stakeholders, and risk assessment. And then in 2015, they established the Marine Renewable Energy Act. That act is not yet in force, but it will be enforced by proclamation. We're not sure when that would happen. It depends on legislation when it's proclaimed. That act established 2 areas of priority, so the Braddock area and the Fundy area. And within those areas of priority, they established a marine renewable electricity area, so that's the list that's on the PowerPoint. There's 4 different areas currently, and for any modifications or extensions of those areas, there would be a system of public consultation and additional environmental requirements if they're extended projects. This act introduces a license and permitting system which include environmental conditions such as reports to be produced, limitations on technology to be used in the project, public consultation, and establishing plans for research, monitoring, risk assessment, and decommissioning of the project. And as well, the Act includes a requirement to reassess these areas within 20 years to ensure that there's minimal impact on marine activities. So I'll pass it over to Chris again.
Thank you, Catherine. Nova Scotia, as Catherine's pointed out, has established this sort of approach to the development of tidal energy, and the legislation, as she mentioned, is because it's important to, at least from the lawyer's perspective, important to remind everyone that it's not yet proclaimed in effect. But the structure and the approach is now relatively well defined, and it is an interesting approach. The combination of, for those of you who don't live in the electricity world, a feed-in tariff is a provision where basically there is a guaranteed minimum price for a renewable electricity produced that the utility must buy. It's very newsworthy in Ontario these days because that's part of what's driving up Ontario electricity customers' rates, but perhaps in Nova Scotia as well. So the idea behind that is to foster developments of projects, and it's had consequences, everything from small-scale wind farms to landfill gas generating units to the potential for tidal development. And the designation of an area or areas for those kinds of projects to occur, for pilot projects to occur after some initial review, an initial assessment, and then to sort of to control and monitor how all this is going to work anyway, frankly. And one of those locations is the so-called force in Minas Passage, which, for those of you who know, up at the very sort of head or end, I guess, of the Bay of Fundy, sort of north of the Annapolis Valley. That force has been established and is basically, there are moorings. So there are places in this area that have been established where you can bring in your tidal turbine and try it out. See how it works, to provide a pilot testing program. There's a whole lot more money involved than bringing it in and trying it out. But at its most basic and fundamental level, that's exactly what it is. And so the province has established basically a one-window review process. And by that, you come up to one window and you ask to do it. And supposedly, at least, there's coordination with all the various government agencies and approval requirements for the installation of your proposal. And those 4 photographs you see in front of you are the 4 current proposals that are underway. The first is Blackrock Tidal, which, according to their latest information they provided, is due for deployment in 2017. The second is Atlantis DP Energy, also 2017. And the very end one that looks a bit like a marine submersible shipyard is Minas Tidal, and it also is on schedule to be potentially deployed in 2017. The third one is going to be the topic of my next few comments, and that is Cape Sharp Tidal. And Cape Sharp Tidal was to deploy in 2016, but hasn't quite yet. A couple of issues emerged with Cape Spear Tidal, and that is that first off, there were some technical problems. They have 2 turbines to potentially deploy, and I'm not exactly sure that they've even disclosed the full nature of what the issues were, but work needed to be done before these things were deployed. There was some issue with the technical issue. And so that work has been done. One of them was towed to St. John, New Brunswick, and where the work was done, or is being done there, I think, as we speak. Cape Spear Tidal has the title of this symposium is Environment in the Courtroom, and rather conveniently for us, we're doing a presentation on tidal energy now finds itself in the courtroom. In June of this year, 2016, the Department of the Environment issued a letter with respect to the environmental effects monitoring program that would be established for the deployment of these turbines. And I have to, in the interest of full disclosure, and why I'm only going to talk a little way, I'll say that my firm and Daniel's firm, among others, are involved in this ongoing litigation. So I'm just going to make some general comments that are, frankly, a matter of public record. We represent clients involved in these matters. The gist of it is that the Minister of the Environment imposing a fairly detailed environmental effects monitoring program on these turbines, among other things, indicated that the department was satisfied with quote-unquote adaptive management approach. And at the risk of horrendously oversimplifying that, the point is that this is all new technology in a new situation. And so exactly what we should be monitoring when and how is in and of itself a bit unknown. And so that the monitoring program was in and of itself supposed to be self-adaptive. As things went on, we may change how we approach what we do, how frequently we do, what we monitor, what we don't. And then pages of terms and conditions on the monitoring program, among other things, largely suggested or imposed by DFO. In July of this year, the Bay of Fundy Inshore Fishermen's Association sought judicial review of this approval, and the matter is now before the courts as we speak. Just in terms of the logistics of the court case, next week there is a motion being heard to basically seek an injunction to stay the minister's order until the hearing of this judicial review application in February of 2017. So as next week, the lawyers and the parties will be before the court seeking a stay of the minister's approval of this environmental effects monitoring program. The gist of the challenge by the Fishermen's Association is twofold. One is that they suggest that the minister failed to put enough evidence and weight on a whole bunch of things. Presence of species at risk, adverse environmental effect, historic data from fishermen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all very interesting. The lawyer in me is most interested in the argument that they make that the minister was guided by the Environmental Act in the province of New Brunswick to, in certain circumstances, adopt a precautionary approach to the monitoring program. So rather than having an adaptive approach, they're suggesting that the Act mandates a precautionary approach, and that the minister failed to take the right approach. Again, for those of you non-lawyers in the room, a judicial review is not necessarily a challenge of the merits of the decision, but the process followed in taking the decision. So they're seeking to quash the minister's decision on his environmental effects monitoring program by saying he didn't take the right approach. He's supposed to take a precautionary approach. Instead, it took an adaptive approach. We shall see. And this next slide is a picture of the turbine. It was a little bit of irony for me. I was appearing as counsel before the National Energy Board for a client at the Energy East pipeline hearings, preliminary sessions that were being held in St. John, New Brunswick. And literally when I walked out the room of the hotel, there tied up immediately in front of me on North Wharf in St. John is the tidal turbine. So we were traditional oil sands pipeline and one behind me and potential tidal renewable generation in front of me. And that's a photo I snapped with my iPhone as I was leaning against the rail on a break that morning in the hearing. So the environment is in the courtroom for tidal development in this part of the country. Literally stay tuned as recent as next week in terms of whether the assessment plan that was put in place, or the monitoring plan put in place, whether it's challenged and what consequences that might have for the deployment of the turbines, which will be soon ready to go, as I understand it. The last thing I'd like to talk about this morning is from a regulatory and offshore energy development or regulation perspective, is an RFP issued by the federal government just a couple of weeks ago on September 28th, looking for a study and an analysis of offshore renewable energy projects, their life cycles, and a regulatory review of projects around the world. Presumably, in recognition of the increased potential for development of offshore renewable resources, both in terms of wind and certainly in terms of tidal, and maybe other things as well, but those certainly are the two. So I think the RFP is potentially helpful to have some sense as to where the federal government may be looking or going from a federal, at least a federal regulatory perspective. So there are basically two aspects of the study that they're seeking. The first is a review of, in essence, what are the work activities, what is required for the things that are on the slide: site characterization, and resource assessment. Environmental seabed surveys, et cetera. What happens during the construction phase? What happens in the operation and the maintenance phase decommissioning that we heard about it at some length a few moments ago, and certainly site rehabilitation. That's one whole aspect of the review that they're seeking. The other half, as it were, is a regulatory review, seeking information and experience from regulators and jurisdictions around the world. Particularly, they note the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and the US, where there is the most offshore energy development taking place at the moment, although the US is mostly wind. In fact, it's all mostly wind. But seeking a regulatory review of matters such as operational safety, health and safety of workers, environmental impact, navigation issues, stakeholder concerns, preservation of local benefits, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, how do the regulators review project applications to ensure that these things are achieved? And presumably to develop some best practices for potential application in Canada as we go on. They're also looking for, what do regulators look for in permitting these activities, and what terms and conditions would they impose for any offshore development? What reports are required? Are there international standards or codes that are used when you evaluate these projects from both an environmental and a business perspective across the board? So, and it's envisioned that this work will be done, I wrote it down, basically it's to be supplied by, I wrote it at the beginning, the proposals are due the 8th of November, and basically the work will take place and wrap up in December of 2017. Actually, it's a two-phase thing. You provide the report by mid-2017 and then be available for consultation, presumably as the federal bureaucrats develop a proposal or potential regulatory policies or approaches as a result through 2017. So once again, I guess if there's a theme to take away from this brief presentation, it really is stay tuned. Stay tuned to some court rulings here in Nova Scotia with respect to the potential deployment of tidal generation. Stay tuned in terms of the federal government's work to regulate or potentially review a regulatory approach to offshore energy development projects, both tidal and wind. And in 25 years, good Lord willing, if I'm still here, I'll come back and tell you that I was right back in 2016, and there's lots of tidal generation going on. Thank you so much.
Questions? Do we have any questions? Questions on tidal? Sure, go ahead.
I don't know if there's any consideration yet of where there are sites, but if you just look at the map, that area between Sackville and Amherst looks like it'd be prime for that's where some really big tides. Has there been any thought given to the interjurisdictional aspects here at all? Or is that just a non-issue?
Well, I know that the province of New Brunswick, I'm being a little flippant, certainly wrung its hands about that issue in terms of, and there was a map, I forget, maybe someone had a map up, I think it was maybe the Professor Ladon had a map that had, or maybe it was Shanti that had the sort of the under the Bay of Fundy border, as it were, between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Yeah, I guess it was you. And the, so Nova Scotia has more of the bay than New Brunswick does. And certainly if you're familiar with the Amherst area, you know that not only do the tides flow, but the winds blow, and there's a wind farm right there beside the highway. That was one of the ones I was alluding to earlier. There hasn't, to my knowledge, been any particular discussion about the interjurisdictional aspects of a development in that area. My sense is that you were, just in terms of anything that's being proposed, it seems to be, at least in New Brunswick example, even though the tides are lower, a little further down the bay, sort of the St. Andrews to St. John to St. Martin's, stretch of the bay. Among other things, it's a lot closer to more significant utility transmission infrastructure there. And that may be what's sort of driving more analysis there than anything. There may also be environmental concerns and may be more environmentally sensitive in the Sackville area. Honestly, I really don't know.
So would the idea be that they'd feed into the LaPro the transmission lines going into New England stuff from LaPro? Or,
Yeah, correct. And give you a grid lesson, but certainly there's a Colson Cove, which is a oil generating station, literally next door to St. John, plus the Point LaPro, and of course Point LaPro also has the interprovincial line, which runs into Maine, sort of a bullet line, as it were. And so there's, I think, sufficient tidal current there, and then some. And then just the proximity to that other sorts of infrastructure, maybe sort of to the extent that there's been an analysis pointing in that direction of the bay.
Thanks very much, Chris and Catherine, for an excellent overview and discussion. What I'd like to just ask you a quick question, and you've started to mention litigation. I've worked pretty extensively in offshore and ocean energy, and particularly within Europe, and looked some aspects of the United States. To what extent are we going a bit down a litigative route that seems to be very present for offshore wind projects in the United States? And also just asking your thoughts about it. Within Europe, per se, there's been a real focus on first developing social and public acceptance, as well as the research base, first for offshore wind and then for ocean energy, and now even for grid infrastructure. And with the grid infrastructure that supports it, for example, they have all the transmission operators working with all the environmental NGOs to set the terms and conditions, particularly for coastal landing. So just asking how do you see it going, and how do you see it potentially could go in a more positive way with integrating all the issues and concerns?
I think I could probably write a paper just answering that question alone. I have sort of considered the two things you said. How should it go, as compared to how do I see it going? I think in fairness, I think the province of Nova Scotia, and while we all sort of stumble along with anything new, no matter what it is in life, to their credit, they invested a great deal of time, money, and effort, attempting to explore this avenue. And I think there has been some, public consultation. Obviously there are fishermen who are challenging a monitoring program before the courts even as we speak. And you could argue that was the result of insufficient consultation involving stakeholders, or maybe not. But at least there's this legislation that's been passed, that's out there, that is public, is available for analysis, for criticism, and it's not been proclaimed in effect. Presumably because there may or may not be the potential to amend it or adjust it in some way, shape, or form. So, yeah, should there be the European sort of style, more comprehensive, integrated, approach to the development of these projects? Yeah. Am I always optimistic that that's how it will unfold? No. Unfortunately not. That doesn't mean that both the developers who were involved or the regulators who were involved don't have the best of intentions to try to achieve that. The good news, I think, is, and I do come back to experience with wind farm development that I've had professionally. And at the outset, there were a lot of those concerns and criticism or suggestions in terms of stakeholder involvement and regulatory integration. But again, like most things in life, those things tend to get worked out. And certainly the development of wind farms now are, I think I used the expression earlier, almost commonplace. And there does get to be comfort in everything from First Nations involvement in these projects, which is active both here and in New Brunswick, to just general public involvement, utility involvement, regulator involvement, environmental assessment involvement. So I am cautiously optimistic sort of when this all comes together that it will eventually come together. Will it start the way it should from the outset? Not so sure.
Okay, yes? Just go.
Hi, Chris. My name's Lisa. I'm with the East Coast Environmental Law Association. And I just have a question about environmental impact assessment. So tidal energy here in Nova Scotia was one of the few, well, perhaps the only process that went through a strategic environmental assessment. And at the time that that happened in 2007 and 2008, it was seen as a really good thing. I mean, it was a pilot in itself in many ways. And I'm curious about your thoughts on if that could have been done differently, if there was another way to manage that strategic process or a way to improve it in the future that would have perhaps prevented what has happened with the litigation that's ongoing now.
A couple of things. One is, and I'll be candid, I'm certainly aware that that strategic assessment took place. In terms of the ins and outs of it, to be able to speak in terms of, if I had to do it all over again, would I recommend slightly different approaches or slightly different things? Like my gentleman predecessors, I do have to take the fifth a little bit in terms of, commenting on what could have been in place to avoid, the current litigation, because I'm not personally myself, but certainly my firm is involved in that matter that's before the courts, so I can't make any sort of public commentary on that. Certainly I would say that and the province of New Brunswick has taken at least, I think, some initial steps toward, that sort of strategic assessment from the outset. The wisdom of such an approach is undeniable, I think. God love Nova Scotia for at least being able to take the lead. I think that there are a lot of jurisdictions, I think, including the one that I live and work in New Brunswick. A bit presumptuous on my part, perhaps, to put the proverbial words in their mouths, but I think a lot of other jurisdictions are playing a wait-and-see role to see how it all unfolds in Nova Scotia, to look at best practices, to learn from Nova Scotia's mistakes, frankly, both from everything from a technological perspective. As all of us are aware, there was a turbine, or maybe not, you're not aware, I'm aware, there was a turbine, and certainly you are, there was a turbine placed in the water, a joint Nova Scotia Power and a French company that developed the turbine. It was put in the water, I think, in 2008 or 2009, and the tides destroyed it. It was an engineering disaster. In fact, it was a significant effort to remove the thing from the bottom. That demonstrated the technological and engineering challenges to be able to harness tidal energy. But as the slide showed earlier, they're back. Engineers, things may fall down, but they will build it up again, give them a chance. And sorry, I'm wavering off the answer to your question a little bit. I really think, forgive the occupational hazard, the short answer is I don't know. But I still managed to talk about it for 5 minutes, so.
All right. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Chris and Catherine for a very interesting presentation as we look forward to tidal in the future. We'll now move to the Canadian Arctic. Our last presentation then for the morning is Offshore Transmission Structures in the Arctic by Magdalena Muir, who's a research associate with the Arctic Institute of North America at the U of C. Thank you, Magdalena.
Oh dear. And then I use this. Perfect. Oh, so how do I use the laser? Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. So I'm going to be talking about offshore Arctic electricity and generation and transmission structures. And so it's slightly broader than just transmission, partly because the nature of the generation shifts that are also occurring. So what we'll talk about first is just the Arctic context, and then electricity generation structures, electricity transmission infrastructure in the Arctic, environmental considerations, including the role of the courtroom, and then finally concluding with conclusions and trends. So just to talk a bit about the characteristics of the Arctic, and that's really important, is really what we have, particularly in the Canadian Arctic, and as we'll discuss during the presentation, this is not necessarily true for other regions, but we have limited transmission infrastructure and predominantly diesel generation for Arctic coasts and islands. If we look at a place like Greenland, for example, in the past 30 years, they've gone from this same model of diesel generation to 70% hydro. So there are other models that we'll talk about and possibilities or future directions. Because we have a marine focus here, we're looking at the coastal communities, so we have many diverse small communities. And an interesting way to think about this is that we have 50% of Canada's coastline up there, 35% of Canada's land mass overall if we look at the Northern Territories, and 53 communities predominantly on the coast. We have limited industrial development, and by that I'm really predominantly referring to mining some hydrocarbons in the different areas that we're going to look at. But that isn't always in proximity to communities, so it can't always benefit those communities as well, because some of the social adaptations or impacts that have been addressed is potentially having, for example, a large mining development, if sufficiently close, sharing its grid infrastructure, sharing its energy sources. Uniquely in Northern Canada, we have very much land claims and joint governance processes, and these two were both touched on by two presentations yesterday by Peter Pamel and Linda Nolan. And I think you'll see that there's quite an interesting approach throughout the Canadian Arctic, which actually would support going to a more sustainable energy platforms and potentially enhancing the grid infrastructure as well. And what we also see is very much increasing Inuit cooperation in Canada along the area that they refer to as Inuit Nunagat, or the Inuit homeland. And so this is just a bit of a map showing you some of the different claims. We're going to be, I'm testing now if this works. We're going to be focusing on the coastal areas. So we're going to be looking at the Inuvialuit Final Agreement, but also some of the related agreements for the Gwich'in and the Saulteaux here, the Nunavut Agreement, and then commenting a bit about some areas in northern Quebec which are subject to other clan claims as well. And sustainable energy and grid infrastructure is very much the Inuit priorities. So we have some commentaries that I'm going to refer to through the presentation, but just to highlight a couple now from the Inuit priorities that were submitted for Canada's climate change strategy. So this is a policy document that came out only in 2016. So very much looking at electricity and related infrastructure such as transmission lines and roads as very much part of what needs to be done in Northern Canada to help the Inuit adapt and mitigate to climate change and the northern regions. So this is just a map I mentioned about the Canadian component of the Inuit Nunagat. So it really encompasses all these different claimant areas. And then there are broader concepts that also incorporate Greenland as well, and into Siberia and the Inuit regions in Siberia. Canada is very much taking the lead on governance within these organizations. Through the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, which is active at the Arctic Council, but also other agencies, partly because there's a very strong administrative structure now put in place, particularly in the Beaufort Sea region and in Nunavut, based on those claims that are now being implemented quite far. So this is what I mentioned about a bit of some of the characteristics, also very specific to it. We've got very much aging generation facilities, whether this is diesel, but also including hydro facilities across much of the Arctic. All the three territories themselves have very much energy strategies in place to promote and support renewable energy efficiency, but also some degree infrastructure, and to reduce the dependence on diesel, which is a very carbon-intensive fuel, but also very environmentally polluting in those areas with potentially significant health impacts at times of the year. We know that we've got very abundant renewable energy resources through those areas, and we'll see how that actually fits into some global schemes for transmission and energy generation. But we also have very much a high-cost environment for electricity generation and transmission. What's been really thought, particularly even in terms of, there's been a recent Senate report that was very much looking at these issues, and it really pointed out that we need to have loan guarantees or some innovative financing approaches in the future. So one thing I thought would be useful just to look at is what we really have for North American electricity grids and to what extent it's really a viable option for much of the territories to connect here. So these are just two different models. I've worked a lot in electricity, so especially in the Alberta system. And they're also with respect to what happens. NERC is very much a North American Electricity Reliability Council, but it deals with very much how the generation moves, what's the backup, and how to keep the grids working across North America. And as you can see, it really doesn't extend too far beyond the provincial boundaries. And we also can think about what a giant initiative it was, at least in Western Canada, to have rural electrification in the last 20 to 50 years. So these are challenges that the northern aspects of many of our provinces are still dealing with or only recently dealt with. So just some illustrations of really what kind of generation we have in the different regions. When we get away from the coasts and the islands in the Arctic, there has been some real initiatives to tie into grid, to use natural gas, and to have at least aging hydro facilities into the southern regions of the Northwest Territories. And this just looks as an example because wind is one of those resources that has looked very much to what extent there might be the use of wind. We've had pilot projects, for example, in the Nunavut territory, but right now no viable actual project. And then we have some different aspects here of wind in the Northwest Territories and in the Yukon Territory, but not adjacent to the coast. So a very large area of opportunity, and also where you have significant variety of resources. This is an illustration of wind, but we also have solar, and there is actually a very interesting solar project in the Mackenzie-Beaufort Sea area in Fort McPherson, where they have created a supplemental solar project that provides up to 10 to 20% of the power to the grid at times of the year. So this looks at the solar resources, also geothermal being quite potential in different areas. And this is very much just thought to be an interesting illustration for you. It really looks at what's a potential vision, and this is quite applicable for one of the regions we're discussed, which is the Mackenzie Delta Beaufort Sea area. So this is the Northwest Territories' vision for a 20-year energy supply. And as you can see up there, they by the time 20 years comes out, which is a few years, it's only been about 3-4 years old, so we're not looking too far into the future, into the early 30s. They have a vision there'll be a lot more different types of renewable energy in the Mackenzie Delta, that there'll be more grid infrastructure and connections between particularly local interconnected communities. And this was very much, I'm not going to get into detail because it's even more preliminary, but we, along with the Bay of Fundy, we've got one of the strongest tidal resources in the world in the Ungava Bay, particularly certain areas there, as well as resources in some straits within Nunavut itself. So here I was just showing you now, because we're getting kind of to look at a bit at transmission issues, is just what the transmission infrastructure looks like in North America. And it's pretty, you can pretty well see it when you start looking at the night picture, how black it is. And that really shows you what is the situation in terms of when you get into more northern regions of our country in terms of rural electrification and access to energy. Again, showing you just some of the different illustrations. As you can see, some of the areas like Alaska have had some pretty active development in this area, and that's one area where there's been a lot more consistent support for renewable energy and different replacements for diesel, sometimes through government, sometimes through indigenous communities or tribes in that area. When I was previously working with the Arctic Council, we had one organization that was very active, and they came from a community that was over 15 years ago was doing renewable energy resources in their community, totally self-funded. So I thought one way of kind of illustrating infrastructure is really try to look at both roads and transmission together. In many areas I'm going to mention, there's really a discussion of having roads at the same time or paralleling it, because when you have these interconnected communities, what you might only have is an ice road for a portion of the year. And if we look at something like the Mackenzie Delta Beaufort Sea area, that's kind of two overlapping claims there, the Inuvialuit final agreement for the offshore, but also the Gwich'in that have had very much overlapping uses in even several communities. So we've got a proposal that's going to be completed for 2017, which is an all-season road that would go from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk. and that's been underway now for a short period. That's going to be a 140-kilometer gravel road. In the absence of this, you have an increasingly short ice road, which you can only use for a lesser part of the year, because the Beaufort Sea in particular is what we've used as a climate hotspot in the Arctic. So it's one of the areas where there's been higher temperatures, more ice breakup at earlier periods. So when you start looking at something like that, and the first one is really the ice road on top, and the one below is you're looking at the proposed routing. You can see this follows the river. This one here avoids the river because you're going to have to build infrastructure, so it's going through what is largely a very marshy delta area for part of the year. And so you're going to have quite a bit of significant gravel used, but you have a shorter route, and that would also be potential for a transmission corridor. Because if it's really difficult to build a very extensive territorial infrastructure, one of the aspects which I think is likely to happen is you're going to start linking more adjacent communities together. And this is one of the communities, I'm referring to an ice road here, but Inuvik itself is quite well connected for a northern community because there's a direct road with the Dempster Highway from Whitehorse. And also in the time period where we've had pullbacks on the hydrocarbon, there's a lot of opportunities that are starting to slowly unfold for example, sustainable tourism there. So different opportunities that are in that area which the infrastructure will support. Another one that's a very interesting one to think about is in a proposal that's really been coming on to take a transmission line from Churchill, Manitoba to Kivalliq in the Northwest Territories, and at the same time to link in all the different communities in this region. But then I should just mention, Nunavut is based on a decentralized model, so they created 3 separate internal regions, and one of them is Kivalliq, which is the western side of Hudson Bay. This is an area that's also had a lot more cooperation. For about 6 years, I was involved in a DFO initiative for coastal management, ending around 2004, which was really trying to have an integrated approach for coastal management for that whole western Hudson Bay, including Manitoba and this region of Nunavut. So there's been a history of cooperation in this area. As well as this transmission line, there's a proposal for a road that also links these all together. So the transmission and the road infrastructure is very linked in this situation. And the person who did this, the group that did the most recent study was actually the Kivalliq Inuit Association, which is actually the leadership group from the Inuit for that whole region. So again, a very high degree of integration and local support for the transmission line, for the road, and for some degree of a substitution from diesel to other forms of energy. Another one I thought it'd be interesting to do, and I mentioned earlier that sometimes industrial development such as mining really encourages these things to occur. So here what we're looking at is another site on Ungava Bay, and despite having very significant tidal resources, what the proposal there's a series of mines, one being the Hopes Advanced Mine, and as part of their proposal, which I think seems to be likely to go forward and which is supported by the Quebec government with Plan du Nord, which is a mining initiative. What you have there is they have proposed that for 2025 they will extend the Hydro-Quebec grid to this mine. So they have to do diesel for the first 7 years from 2018 when they begin, and then by 7 years they will have electricity that is hydroelectricity. So an integration between the provincial grid and the mining community. I should also mention there have been one of the key aspects or blockades that were happening in Quebec for Northern Development for a period of time were unresolved differences between the Quebec government and the Inuit and the Cree. There have been some series of even more recent agreements that encompass mining developments, exploitation of the tidal eventually with Ungava, and extension of grid infrastructure. So there's been a very integrated approach in this area which would facilitate or at least remove some of the barriers you might otherwise anticipate. I mentioned there's also other aspects of transmission. As we know, I mentioned earlier that Greenland in particular, and the area around Nuuk, the capital, has 70% hydroelectric development supplying. They've also had a very integrated approach to using batteries, hydrogen, integrating heat, energy, water treatment. So very much interesting approaches throughout. They're using very high efficiency generators in some of the northern areas. But one of their ideas is that they will actually build a transmission line to Nuuk on Baffin Island, which is one of the other regions under the Nunavut territory and Nunavut Final Agreement, and supply electricity there. So what that would mean is the investment that Greenland makes in hydroelectricity, particular future hydroelectricity, would be underpinned by Nunavut purchases. This is partly a response because it's very difficult to get investment in Nunavut. For example, there has been a very extensive project planning for a hydroelectric facility near Iqaluit, which would actually service the Iqaluit and the surrounding area. But there's been difficulties with getting the financing because the territorial government or the provincial or the territorial utility cannot get the funding to do so or get the approvals to run into the debt. So you have a system where you could build a long-term facility which might reduce overall costs, particularly diesel, but to get that you would have to have the ability for the territory or the utility to enter into debt or some degree of a loan finance or guarantee. In the absence of that, if they can't do that, what would potentially happen is Nunavut would underwrite someone else's investment. So there's always choices. This is about a relatively short transmission line here. So it could be accommodated, it might be feasible. I think I saw some estimates, and I don't quote me on it, but in a couple $100 million. I mean, this is just not the only portion. This is actually one of their smallest offshoots proposing it. The main area for this North Atlantic Energy Network is really taking energy from and bringing energy to Greenland from Iceland, and then Iceland here has a very large, moving to Norway, and there's actually proposals also to take Icelandic geothermal and hydro resources and take them to the UK. So it's part of very much a European approach, but might extend to this other direction, particularly because the Nordic Investment Bank is very much willing to support sustainable energy development and infrastructure in northern regions. There's other interesting ones and very much an Arctic component. So if we look at Svalbard, which is an international territory north of Norway, it's partly Russian and partly Norwegian. They have, a number of years ago, they basically mined coal there, and that was actually some of the economic impetus for the Russians to be there, as well as sovereignty issues. So they have a coal-fired generation facility, which I have an image of here. And what they are talking about in Longyearbyen, they're talking about actually running a transmission line from Longyearbyen to Norway. And so bringing electricity through this proposed transmission line. Interesting aspect about it, at least they're currently doing local production, but Norway has invested very significantly in Svalbard, for example, more so than Russia. And so what they've ended up doing, they already have a high fiber optic cable that moves data from Svalbard to and from Norway and the continent. So it might just be twinned with an existing route, because routing is always a very important issue when you deal with these submarine transmission lines that are high voltage typically. And so the Arctic's always an area for dreamers. So the Chinese State Grid Corp, just as in late 2015, also put its own world vision forward about how they might incorporate Arctic renewable energy into a global grid. And I've worked a lot on grid development in, for example, Europe and the adjacent regions, so the North Sea, but there's also an area that's being talked very much about and which has started being developed in North Africa called Desertec, where they were talking about exporting solar energy. So this is really kind of meshing these all together, and it just looks at what are the potential, particularly wind, for the Arctic regions. And so this kind of just shows you where they're envisioning it, partly from an Arctic perspective. So you would have Arctic being a source of wind, and then there'd be the extension of these regional grids within, let's say, North America, and then taking the power to other areas which is more needed, being China or Europe or some of the other population densities. So it's kind of an interesting one. The prior slide was done by the Wall Street Journal, because they were quite interesting when it came out, when they're looking at the potential. And it might seem, it potentially is a future vision, because there's almost two different future visions. The world is an interconnected grid, or where we have local decentralized production, which doesn't require the grid and maybe the grid investments. Now, the whole topic here is environmental considerations. And so I apologize for being a bit shorter on it, but I wanted to give you doing this extensive introduction, but I wanted to show you how much what I'm talking about are things that are actually supported already and which are actually improving the current environmental situation. So if we just start as a background, always to think about what happens in Northern Canada is very much Section 35.3 of the Canadian Constitution, which talks about affirming existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And that includes the land claims, which are very developed structures, and the related self-government agreements, because every area I've shown you which has a land claim also either has formal or informal governance initiatives continuing. And we have that. And so what we have, because of that, we have very highly developed administrative processes in the north for the marine, coastal, and island areas that are likely to be where the first regulation, including environmental and social impact, will be dealt with for these kinds of projects or initiatives. And we also, because of the nature of the land claims and Aboriginal rights in Canada, we have a lot of history of jurisprudence. And for example, one of the more recent one is that the First Nation consultation process continues even if there is a land claim consultation process, and that was very much tested recently with Clyde River and a proposal for seismic, which was eventually opposed by some of the communities there, Clyde River. So again, we have these vision of the different modern treaties, which are very much part of this Inuit concept of homeland, where there's an integrated approach and some very common concerns along the coasts and islands for energy. This are some of just the illustrations of some of your different processes that you would have for the administrative court and litigative framework to deal with environmental considerations. And for example, you would, in terms of who are the authorities in there, you would have some federal authorities, some territorial authorities, but predominantly the authorities would be some of your different boards, whether dealing with land use planning, environmental impact assessment. And for example, within Nunavut, there is a combined board, a marine board for the offshore. Within the Inuvialuit settlement region, which I know Linda commented in her paper, they talked about the recommendary and advisory process, but in practice, even though it was a slightly different agreement, in practice it's more than that. It's almost all the, for example, if I look at DFO as an example where I worked extensively, all the research and decisions, implementation decisions, resourcing decisions are made jointly between these boards, whether it's the Fisheries Joint Management Committee or with respect to the Nunavut boards. So very much an integrated approach. So I wanted to talk a bit about some things, and I wanted to go back now to some of the comments on the Inuit priorities from Canada's Climate Adaptation Strategy of 2016. So, and you can really see in this how essential more sustainable energy generation and infrastructure, particularly roads and transmission, really is. So, as they say in that, the cost of living is very high in our communities, and the provision of heating and electricity and almost any other necessity is dependent on carbon-intensive activities. Their long-term expectations of climate change include ensuring that the Inuit drive strategic planning and climate-resilient northern infrastructure technologies, including social, economic, and environmental benefits for the communities. On the short term, that's really a roadmap for lower emissions in generation, as well as addressing northern infrastructure deficits for energy transmission and the wastewater treatment. And there's very strong reference to the transition from diesel to hydroelectric energy as one of those objectives. So then if we start looking at some of the points here, so we think about it, we have Arctic electricity generation systems are really reaching the end of their useful life, and they need to be extended to meet increased community and industrial demand. So for example, within Nunavut, almost every diesel generator has to be replaced. In every community, you have at least 2 generators because you need backup capacity. So there's quite a bit of interest in exploring hybrid systems with maybe one diesel with another mechanism and developing local capacity and of the resources and implementation of that. Within the comments on the adaptations aspect and the climate strategy, there's a reference there to significant investment both for capacity development and also for the actual implementation of the projects. So one of the key conclusions in trends is that you really need to have significant investment in new electricity and generation and transmission throughout Arctic Canada. And at this time, there's a really good potential to shift to electricity generation and transmission with less environmental impacts, greater efficiencies, and lower greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of how some of this could be done, I think there's going to be two different trends. First of all, the southern grid expansion where it's adjacent, because if we look at what was happening proposed for Ungava, that was really extending the Hydro-Quebec grid, and what's proposed with respect to Kivalliq, that's extending the Manitoba Hydro. So very much a southern grid expansion in certain instances, but in other areas, very much a decentralized grid system approach, which potentially might not even need that much transmission infrastructure. There's going to be the real necessity of those innovative financing approaches that I've mentioned, because that is really the crippling aspect in northern Canada. Parties are aware of what needs to be done, but there isn't the restructuring or the availability of sufficient finance to allow it to do so. In terms of where the technology is going in many parts of the world, and we even see some examples in Greenland, which has similar environmental situations, you have very much the setup of local grid systems, smart systems with energy storage as well as renewable energy and very high efficiency diesel. We have that possibility of coastal or submerged transmission lines between Arctic regions, some such as the Manitoba to Kivalliq, which are very much an extension and within Canadian territory, others being a potential bringing it in from other regions. But if we do that, we're funding other regions' economic development and not our own. And over the longer term, and we'll have to see how that goes, because then again, it goes to your model of whether or not we build infrastructure, that there might be the integration of Arctic renewable energy into North American and global electricity transmission. So thank you for your attention. There's a couple of different projects where there's a lot of this dealt with, but I'm happy to entertain questions.
Are there any questions?
I'll start off with one. I guess, Magdalene, what really struck me, I was surprised, and was the emphasis on sort of conventional extensions of transmission grids in the north. And I was surprised because I was expecting to see a lot of distributed energy, that would be the approach they'd take, especially because of environmental considerations. Now, you mentioned that's one aspect. Have you got any sense of sort of how it would break down roughly in percentage terms, how they see the future in terms of, you know, smaller distributed energy as opposed to these grid expansions, which normally one would think, especially in northern areas, would be enormously expensive for small communities?
It really depends on proximity. So what we have to think about, and I'm only asked to talk about electrical transmission line. I work a lot in hydrocarbons too, so it's hard not to speak about that. And I was asked to talk on Arctic coasts, which are our most remote regions. But if we look at the southern borders of the territorial thing, we already know that there's gas lines that are extending and gas systems that are extending into the Yukon, largely for extractive purposes, but also for local production. And then it gets linked to a mining development, for example. So it makes a lot of sense to actually have the adjacency because, for example, near Ungava Bay, Quebec would really like to develop some of these northern resources further. Similarly with Quebec Hydro. So those provinces all have northern development strategy, and they see this as a good example. And again, that underpins their investment. So I would see something like what's proposed for Kivalliq as a very logical reason, because there's also extensive historic mining development there about Baker Lake, and that's part of the proposal also for the transmission line, where these industrial hosts will either pay a portion of the grid or will actually underpin it through their tolls. Now, when we start looking at most of what I'm talking about, which is the coastal region, it's pretty remote, and there is a lot of parallels between our Arctic archipelago and coasts and small island developing states and the opportunities. And in those cases, you will actually see grids, and that's why I'm proposing it would be more within regional areas. Like the area around Callowwood has a big percentage of Nunavut's population, so you'd probably want to use that for local regional development in that area. The Beaufort Sea region is actually one of the very developed areas of the Arctic coast, and so it makes sense to have a grid structure there. But in the other areas, the real question then becomes, what are you going to do? And probably what's going to be grid is going to be what they call a community-based grid system.
Yeah, thank you, Magdalena. It was a very interesting presentation. I was interested in how extraction projects, whether it's mining, oil and gas, can assist in developing the grid. Whenever there's a project, infrastructure project developed in the north, they have to go through environmental assessment plans, and they've got to go through a NERB, the Nunavut, especially Nunavut Impact Review Board, and they have to prepare an impact benefit agreement. And I'm wondering, or at least the developers do, along with NERB, and I'm wondering whether you may see, or we will be seeing in the future, as part of the impact benefit agreement that are agreed to by the project developers, an undertaking to attach their own energy development grids to the local grids, or at least to assist with the expansion of their energy source, and to assist the communities in the outlying areas or closer to the mine. And we see that built into the impact benefit agreement that they agreed to up front as part of the cost of the project. Do you see that developing in the future?
It's certainly there where the proximity is there. So that's where I mentioned Kivalliq, that region and the different communities they're trying to interlink. They actually in proximity to historic uranium resources and other resources that parties would like to develop. So that would be part of the proposal. There's a Mary River iron ore project that's in northern Baffin Island. One of the issues there, they're building a road to access the difference between their mine and their port. And one of the things the community's been very engaged in is actually getting access to that road, which is another form of vital infrastructure. So where there is proximity, you would probably find no issues, but sometimes these mines are very remote from communities, so you can't really do it. There were some attempts by the Northwest Territories government for some of, I think, the diamond mines at the time, where they were trying to get them to underpin a transmission line from, I believe it was Alberta, that would have been over $1 billion, and they just wouldn't buy it, because they have a mine that has a life of 10 to 20 years. So if some of them, for example, like Diavik, have a renewable energy like wind that provides a portion of their mine energy, if they were in proximity to a community, you probably wouldn't have too much issues. The problem really is the proximity issue. And this brings up another issue it's kind of interesting to think about too. There have been some cases where they tried to propose renewable energy in some communities and parties tried to impose an impact and benefit agreement. Well, providing energy, water, sanitation are really community-based services. They're extremely expensive. Like Nunavut has got some of the highest energy prices in Canada. I'd hate to see how they think on a world scale, but I think they'd be very much in there. And energy is crucial, because when it's minus 60, that's why you have full backup, because you can't have energy failure. So the replacement of the generations, the renewable energy, will not be able to support a very generous impacts and benefit agreement compared to a large-scale resource development.
Another question? No? Okay, then the final question, which I'll ask, tying this into coastal marine protection in the northern environment. We heard in our earlier presentation in terms of tidal and the novel issues that are posed by tidal. We've heard about the potential for wind development. There's solar development in the Northwest Territories. We've mentioned submarine cables running from Greenland through to Nunavut. Are there any environmental impacts, you would say, that are perhaps unique to northern Canada that we have to give careful thought to in terms of protecting the marine environment, again, in terms of coastal areas or further offshore?
Well, let me focus on the transmission line, because that was a core component of what I'd like to deal with. When you deal with high voltage transmission lines, there's research in the UK that some colleagues of mine have been very active in dealing with the effect on electromagnetic fields and on certain benthic organisms, particularly sharks and skates, which have some degree of a compatible system to be affected. So that's something which is happening globally that people are looking at, and there's different mechanisms to deal with it, potentially insulating the line, where you place it, do you bury it? And that's actually been a debate quite a bit in Europe as they try to use offshore infrastructure to avoid some of the social controversy in having high voltage lines on land. So that's one aspect which is everywhere, and so there is enough knowledge out there about how to do some of this. The bigger aspect that's probably really problematic there when you do both the terrestrial and the offshore transmission lines and some of the infrastructure is the effect of the shifting permafrost. And we saw that for some parties that were following the Mackenzie Gas Project, and even some of the Alaska ones, where based on permafrost, some of the infrastructure sinking just by the weight and the own heat. So what you have to almost do as well as insulation is potentially doing things like refrigerate. So it's quite interesting, some of the challenges that are going to be occurring for just some of the infrastructure. All these things we've been talking about because the nature of the topic is dealing with coasts and islands, and some of the areas in the Canadian Arctic have very unstable coastlines, which were only shored up by the ice edge. For example, if you look at Tuktoyaktuk, that predominantly is like an ice cube with sand and grit in it. And that's true of some other regions of the coast, particularly, let's say, parts of the Hudson Bay lowlands, which are adjacent to Manitoba and Nunavut in the Kivalliq region. So you're going to have a lot of issues of trying to deal with the nature of the terrain, its erosion, and that's specific even where there was talking about the LNG projects and now how they unload fuel oil. They have to have a floating pipe because it's problematic to have permanent coastal structures in some areas. So I think there's a lot of specific challenges as you have increased climate change, and especially in some of these areas, and coastal erosions and degradation of permafrost aggravated by the types of built environment you superimpose.
Great. Well, thank you very much for a very informative presentation looking ahead. We are bang on schedule. We have an hour for lunch courtesy of the Faculty of Law at the U of C. Would you please join us for lunch, and then we'll have the panel this afternoon, and look forward to talking to you then after lunch.